Yes.
Dr. McClelland, you referred to one of the advisory committees and the discussion of starting this arrangement with the PFC. For the sake of completeness, we're just going to look at those minutes. CBLA 00001287. These are the minutes of a meeting of the Advisory Committee on the National Blood Transfusion Service, 23rd of February 1981. If we just go a little further down so we can see the full list of attendees, we'll see that, as you observed, Dr. McClelland, you were not present at this meeting, but the observers included Dr. Lawson from the Department of Health and Social Services in Northern Ireland. And if we go to the second page, if we pick it up in paragraph 6, halfway down the page, there's a heading pro rata supply of blood products, and then paragraph 6 explains, the chairman explained that the pro rata distribution of certain blood products was due to start from the 1st of April 1981, and paper AC 81-3 set out those issues on which the department sought the committee's advice, particularly in relation to supplies to special units. And then there's a discussion of whether special arrangements need to be made for various organisations. But if we go to the next page, paragraph 9 at the top of the page, it says, on the question of other users, members agreed that, and then D, the pro rata scheme should apply to Northern Ireland. Dr. Lawson explained that the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service intended to send plasma, both time expired and fresh frozen, to the Protein Fractionation Centre, Edinburgh. This had been agreed by the directors concerned. So I think that's those are the minutes that you may have been referring to in your evidence earlier this morning.
I think that's right.
Now, if we then just pick matters up with your own communications with Scotland on this issue, NIBS 0001680. This is a letter from Dr. Cash to you, 11th of March 1981. Thanks you for a letter of the 4th of March, says at least we've made a start. Now, it seems to me that it might be helpful to you with regard to interactions with colleagues in your Department of Health if I made the following comments. And then paragraph 1, the SNBTS directors would prefer to see an evolution of the relationship with the NIBTS in which you were integrated as far as possible into our organisation as an equal partner in terms of access to blood products from PFC and indeed on any professional matters related to policy, etc. At this point, I believe we should assume this is what you would wish to see emerge, but we must all be aware that contrary views may exist in our respective departments of health, who may wish to operate a strict contractual pro rata arrangement for all products. Such an arrangement would have significant attractions to our administrative colleagues who have to deal with financial and political matters. Such an approach may be of some concern to yourself. You would, for instance, receive no anti-D immunoglobulin. Did the relationship between the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service and SNBTS evolve in the way in which Dr. Cash was hoping for, with you integrated into the organisation as an equal partner?
I think so, broadly, yes. Obviously, we, as he says, with anything that had any policy that had an impact on the relationship with PFC, would have required NIBTS to follow the policy in Scotland. But regarding other matters, well, it was really up to ourselves in Northern Ireland whether we wish to follow the Scottish approach, the English approach, or our own approach.
Paragraph 2 observes strenuous efforts have been made by the SNBTS regions in the last 5 years to meet the concept of self-sufficiency. And then Dr. Cash refers to a table, which I don't think I need to trouble you with. And then the bottom of the page says this, paragraph 3, there is no doubt that the most immediate and pressing problem is to get the NIBTS transferred to HBsAg RIA testing of all donations. Such a move would bring you into line with all plasma coming into PFC. So what was the issue, Dr. McClelland, in relation to the hepatitis B surface antigen testing?
Well, at that point, the method used by NIBTS for hepatitis B screening was the RPHA, reverse passive hemagglutination method, which had been in operation, I think, since about the mid-1970s, I think. The sensitivity level was somewhat lower than RIA, and I think advice was coming through from the fractionation perspective, that from expert advisors that centres should be looking to change to the more sensitive technique. I must say, I've personally welcomed this move, this if you like to call it a requirement by PFC, because I was very keen for us to go on to RIA in any case as our routine method. So we were able to take steps to put that in place. It was not easy because the existing method of hepatitis B screening was carried out in a very, very cramped, very small, cramped facility, which would have been totally inappropriate and impossible to use for a radioisotope-based method. So we had to identify, fortunately, we did have one space, which was used for staff, which had that potential. So, but it did take a little bit of time to get that work carried out, so that we were able to look at starting this the RIA testing.
Now, some months after this, I think in around September 1981, there was a visit from the PFC to the premises of NIBTS. I'm not going to put up on screen the report of that visit, but for the transcript, and if anyone wants to look at it, it's SCGV 0000104_117. What I will ask you to look at, Dr. McClelland, is a letter that was written referring to that inspection in September 1981. It's NIBS 0001698. This is a letter of the 3rd of September 1981. It's from John Watt, Scientific Director of the PFC, to Dr. Cash, and it was copied to you. That's apparent from the end of the letter. If we look at the first few paragraphs, it says, Dr. Perry and I visited Belfast on 18th of August to see the working arrangements of the Transfusion Centre and to discuss with Dr. McClelland the detail necessary to get plasma to Scotland in good order and to return fractions to Northern Ireland. The actual mechanics of the transfer will be best handled by sending the PFC truck to Belfast on a routine monthly basis to collect plasma and deliver product. And then the next paragraph says the arrangements made in Belfast for collection and handling of fresh frozen plasma are basically sound, but will require some modification in the area of quality control. Dr. Perry is already in correspondence with Dr. Barucha, Deputy Director, on the main QA topics and plans to return to Belfast tomorrow, 4th September, to continue these discussions. And then there's a reference to the need for microbiological monitoring, which is said to create the greatest problem since there was no in-house facility. And then if we go over the page, top of the next page, looking at the centre with an inspector's eye, it was clear that Dr. McClelland had problems getting access to adequate standard and sufficiently fast response so far as building and equipment maintenance was concerned, beyond those items in his own hand where contract maintenance of centrifuges, LAF cabinets, etc. were concerned. We were shown a modification in course of progress to refit an area for hepatitis testing, but which would be only barely adequate when finished, a deficiency of which Dr. McClelland was only too well aware. Just pausing there, was there anything in that paragraph and those observations that you disagreed with Dr. McClelland, or would you accept the accuracy of what was set out there?
No, I would have agreed with that, I think.
And then the next paragraph says we would require a reasonable commitment from Dr. McClelland or his board that effort would be made to bring the centre to a position that would meet the need of PFC so far as the centre was a supplier of raw material for fractionation. No doubt the Medicines Inspectorate would hold the same view. However, it is recognised that this could not happen overnight, whereas both Dr. McClelland and the NIHD would wish transfer of plasma to PFC to start before the end of 1981. And then the next paragraph refers to the facilities for hepatitis testing by RPHA, and that equipment was awaited for the RIA testing. And the next paragraph explains that you are anxious to get a programme started with PFC. And then if we could just go to the bottom of the page. So the last three paragraphs are a discussion about what quantities might be provided. The last paragraph says this: the figures I've quoted are safe minima, but I would expect on a best efforts basis the PFC could do better than they suggest. Recent trends in recovery of factor VIII, for example, would yield about 1.3 million IU or 6,000 dose units of 220 IU average content. Such a return might persuade Dr. McClelland to move steadily away from cryo toward concentrate in time. What did you understand, or what, looking at now, do you think was meant by that last sentence about persuading you to move steadily from cryo toward concentrate?
I can't actually remember. It seemed to be felt by the Scots that we were producing a relatively large amount of cryo, although I wouldn't have thought that was all that apparent. So I don't fully understand that there would have been much potential to move any further away from cryo. Anyway, in any case, the amount of cryo would have been determined by clinical demand by the hospitals, and we would expect to have to respond to that.
And then the letter continues over the page. I don't need to ask you to look at the detail of it. If I can just ask you to look at the previous page to that, Sally. The last paragraph. First sentence of the last paragraph. One area which concerns Northern Ireland is that of cost. Is it right to understand, Dr. McClelland, that question of cost, what payments would be made, was dealt with at departmental level, so between the Department of Health and Social Services Northern Ireland and its Scottish counterparts, rather than being negotiated by you?
Well, I know the financial arrangement that was worked out, that was on the basis of a charge being applied to each individual product. And as far as I can recall, those charges were really set by PFC, presumably based on their costs, on the costs of manufacturing them. I don't recall that there were any great negotiation on the actual cost. I think the unit price for the products was basically set by PFC.
If we then turn to one further document, which is SCGV 0000104_090. Sorry, SCGV 0000104_090. Now, these are the notes of a meeting to discuss the supply of blood products to Northern Ireland, and the date of the meeting is the 26th of August 1982. We can see that there are a number of representatives there from Scotland and Northern Ireland, including yourself. And then paragraph 1 explains that the purpose of the meeting was to discuss arrangements for the supply of blood products to Northern Ireland. Paragraph 2 is headed Progress towards resolution of defects noted in report of visit to Belfast in 1981. And it records Mr. Watt stated that it was clear that the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service was also affected by the provisions of the Medicines Act, to which the Protein Fractionation Centre had already been heavily exposed. On his visits to Belfast, he had only been able to identify general defects, although it was clear that much new building would be required. In addition, quality assurance procedures required to be formalised and validated, although in this respect, the Belfast was in no worse a position than elsewhere in the UK. The PFC was already 3 years down this road. And then there's a reference to an anticipated visit to Belfast from the Medicines Inspector. And then it says, Dr. Perry reported that problems which had earlier been identified in relation to hepatitis testing and testing of hyperimmune plasma had now been resolved. If we go over the page, top of the next page, there was already a good exchange of information between the PFC and the Belfast Centre, which in Mr. Watt's view did not have the resources to tackle the implications of the Medicines Inspectorate report alone. Dr. Lawson, who, as we've already seen, was from the Department of Health and Social Services Northern Ireland, advised that the provision of a new BTS centre in Belfast was in the very early stages of consideration, so clearly interim arrangements might well be required. It had been accepted, however, in Northern Ireland as a matter of principle that steps would be required to improve the facilities of the blood transfusion service following the Medicines Inspectorate report. And then paragraph 3 refers to the need for the Northern Ireland BTS to enter into a commitment in respect of certain professional matters. I'm not going to go through the detail of them, but we can see subparagraph D, HBsAg testing. It was noted that this matter had been resolved, although the need for a UK reference lab for such testing was recognised. So is it right to understand that by the date of this meeting, August 1982, you had changed from the RPHA method of testing to the RIA method of testing?
That's correct.
And then top of the next page, paragraph 4 refers to transport. Preferred option with regard to transportation of plasma and products between Belfast and Edinburgh was for NIBTS to supply a suitable vehicle to make one round trip per month from Belfast, with air transport being used as a fallback in case of disruption of ferry services, etc. There's then a reference to the financial arrangements and a reference to there having been preliminary discussions on financial arrangements, not proposing to go through the detail of those. And then paragraph 7 records Dr. Cash's proposal that you would be invited to all meetings of the Scottish Transfusion Directors and their coordinating group and would be issued with appropriate papers. So is it right to understand, Dr. McClelland, from the note of this meeting, August 1982, that the arrangement with the PFC had not yet actually started? It was obviously well advanced by the time of this meeting in terms of planning, but you hadn't yet begun supplying fresh frozen plasma to the PFC.
I think that's right. Yes, that probably would have. This was August
1982.
82. I think that would have commenced shortly, with perhaps a couple of months later. I'm not 100% sure of that.
But bearing in mind that we saw that advisory committee meeting from February 1981, which showed that there was agreement in principle that this should be the arrangement, it appears to have taken around 18 months or so to actually put the arrangement into practice. Why did it take that long?
A mixture of issues. Some I would say administrative, given the fact that there were two levels or three levels of administration involved, with the Departments of Health, the Common Services Agency and the Eastern Board at the next level, and then the blood transfusion centres. I remember there was a bit of frustration around delays at that level with the necessary communications taking place or not taking place. And the other factor, of course, was at the operational level. There was quite a lot of work. We talked about the radioimmunoassay and quite a lot of additional work, building work to be carried out. That was certainly always going to take some time. Quite a lot of additional equipment, the snap freezing equipment had to be purchased and commissioned. That would have taken, and deciding what was the appropriate type of equipment. Those are probably the main causes that come to mind.
And then, in terms of the mechanics of the arrangement, was it your understanding that plasma collected in Northern Ireland would be kept separate from or pooled with Scottish plasma at the PFC?
I think my understanding was that it would be pooled with Scottish plasma.
If we can then just look at NIBS 00001719. Now, this was a letter from you to Professor Bridges, 22nd of May 1984. It appears the main topic of the letter was regarding plasma protein fraction, rather than the supply of fresh frozen plasma for the production of factor VIII. But I just wanted to ask you about what's set out in the third paragraph. It says the PFC Edinburgh have recently reached the limit of their capacity and is no longer able to fractionate all plasma received from transfusion centres in Scotland and Northern Ireland. This applies only to outdated plasma. All fresh frozen plasma is being fractionated in order to meet the demand for factor VIII, for which we have now reached a position of being self-sufficient. And then you go on to say that the PFC position was a temporary problem. Plans to increase capacity are unlikely to materialise before early 1986. Now, if we leave aside any issue relating to plasma protein fraction, my question is really about that bit in brackets. where it says we've now reached a position of being self-sufficient. So this is May 1984. How should we understand your suggestion that in relation to Factor H, Northern Ireland was now self-sufficient?
Yes. It often comes down to definition of what you mean by self-sufficiency. Certainly, I think even by this stage, we had reached the point where we were producing at least as much, if not beyond, the quantity. When we set up the arrangement, there was a certain amount of Factor 8 usage, obviously, and I think we had certainly reached that level, if not somewhat beyond that level. But I'm not sure. I'm a little bit, in fact, a little bit surprised to see that, because I'm not sure that we certainly were not using 100%. PFC Factor 8 at that point, because the total demand was starting to increase really quite rapidly.
Well, that leads to the next issue I wanted to explore with you, Dr. McClelland, which is concerning the supply of concentrates to the Haemophilia Centre in Belfast.
If we just stop there for the moment, what you've just been asking Dr. McClelland about is in respect the meaning of self-sufficient. It may be that what you had meant to say was that theoretically self-sufficient, because if you read the last two sentences of that paragraph, you say for the next year or two we will be receiving no more than 85% of our full entitlement. If all plasma supplied from here was being fractionated, we could in fact have met the demand in full. In other words, you can't meet the demand in full because you're not getting 100% back. Is that how it should be read?
I think this is referring to plasma protein fraction, or albumin, if you like.
I see.
Where they have, where there seemed to be a temporary pause in manufacture. Obviously, priority was given to Factor 8 production. But yes, I remember there was a pause. Also, I think it may have been related to staffing issues at PFC, but I can't remember exactly.
Yes. I had thought that perhaps the last paragraph of the next paragraph that follows, it was talking about PPF, whereas this particular couple of sentences followed on from the reference to Factor 8 and self-sufficiency. But I don't know. It's obviously some time since you've read this letter.
Yes.
Dr. McClelland, more broadly, can I then explore with you the arrangements for the supply of concentrates to the Haemophilia Centre in Belfast? But before I ask you specifically about the arrangements with Dr. Main, were there other hospitals in Northern Ireland that you supplied with either cryoprecipitate or factor concentrate?
As far as cryoprecipitate was concerned, we may have, I think we supplied some hospitals with a small amount of cryoprecipitate. As far as I remember, I'm pretty sure that all Factor 8 concentrate would have been issued from the Haemophilia Centre to those other hospitals.
So, first of all, in relation to the small amount of Elstree BPL factor concentrates that you or that the service was receiving prior to the arrangement with PFC. That was, as I understand it, received by the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service, was it, and then supplied by you to Dr. Main, or did BPL
Yes.
send that was the route?
Yeah.
And then once the arrangement with the Protein Fractionation Centre was up and running, was it the same position that you received the factor VIII concentrate from the PFC and you then supplied it to Dr. Main?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, we know from other evidence the inquiry has received, but also from your own evidence, that a significant amount of commercial factor VIII concentrates were used by the Haemophilia Centre in Belfast. Were those supplied via the Blood Transfusion Service, or were they procured directly by the Haemophilia Centre, as far as you can recall?
The latter, they were procured by the Haemophilia Centre and supplied to the Haemophilia Centre direct.
So you had no direct involvement in the arrangements to obtain commercial concentrates?
That's correct. No, we didn't. We had no involvement in that.
And does it follow that the choice of which commercial concentrates was a choice made by the Haemophilia Centre rather than by you?
That's correct.
Is it also right, however, that the cost of the commercial concentrates was a cost that essentially came out of the Blood Transfusion Service's budget?
Yes, I think from 1985, new financial arrangements were established so that, I was quite, I think it was myself who had proposed it actually, that in order, it was becoming complicated to estimate the demand, because when we started off this arrangement with PFC, hospitals, this really applies to the products like albumin, purchased their own, they received product from NIBTS, but any shortfall was made up by purchasing from commercial providers. It was difficult for us to know what the demand was at any one time, and I'd proposed that the arrangement be centralised at NIBTS, so that we knew exactly what our targets were going to be, and that applied to factor VIII and coagulation concentrates as well, in the sense that the budget sat with NIBTS / Eastern Board, which was who really held the budget, but the actual arrangements for ordering, procuring the product and decisions about which product was made by the Haemophilia Centre. It meant that we were, because it was funded or sat on the NIBTS budget, it meant at any one time we were informed about actual usage of factor VIII, commercial and DFs and NHS.
The inquiry's heard evidence that some regional transfusion centres themselves held commercial concentrates and then supplied them to the relevant Haemophilia Centre. Did you ever discuss with Dr. Main or anybody else changing to a system whereby the commercial concentrates were ordered by and held by you?
No, I don't think so. I don't recall doing that. I think I would have recognized that in this specialized area of blood product treatment, the haemophilia directors were the experts. They were in possession of all the information, and it would have seemed to me we're in the best position to make those decisions.
If we have a look at NIBS 00001714, this is a letter from Dr. Cash to Dr. Main, dated the 5th of January 1984. And he says in the first paragraph, through colleagues here at our protein fractionation centre, I've discovered that there's been a fairly substantial movement of commercial factor VIII, purchased in Edinburgh, we think, and shipped to you in exchange for the PFC material you have received via Morris McClelland. Am I right? If so, could you illuminate? On the face of it, this development looks a little worrying, AIDS, etc. I'm anxious to help as much as possible. And then we can see that this letter was copied to you. Do you recall whether you had been, prior to receiving this letter from Dr. Cash, aware of this arrangement?
No, I wasn't aware of the arrangement before it happened. I'm not sure if this was the first time this letter was the first time I was aware. I think it may well have been. No, I wasn't aware in advance of the arrangement.
Had you been aware of it, would you have been concerned? Because it might be said to be undermining the work that was being done to achieve self-sufficiency for Northern Ireland in factor concentrates.
Yes, somewhat concerned. I mean, I understood the rationale, I think, behind the arrangement, but I would have thought this was the kind of thing that probably should have been approved at sort of higher administrative level in advance. As I think the Chief Medical Officer from Northern Ireland, maybe not, I'm not sure, I can't remember if it was in relation to this arrangement or a future one, spelled that out. That this kind of arrangement should really have been approved in advance at a higher level, at a higher administrative level.
Now, the inquiry knows from other material, including documents authored by Dr. Main at the time, that until the end of 1984, virtually all of the treatment used at the Haemophilia Centre was commercial concentrates. Those are her own words. The reference for the transcript is BHCT 00000503. Do you recall ever having any discussions with Dr. Main about her use of commercial concentrates, or trying to discourage the use of them at all?
Yes, regular discussions about. I mean, I had a session, a regular weekly session in the Royal Hospital, clinical haematology session. So I was, in a way, Dr. Main was a colleague because I was visiting the Royal on a weekly basis, sometimes twice weekly basis. So I was in discussion with Dr. Main on a very regular basis. But I would have accepted that she was the expert in this area, there were a number of factors that had to be taken into account at any one time in deciding about which product to use at a certain length, at a certain point in time. And for example, if a major operative procedure which might require huge amounts of factor VIII, the appropriate product to use for that situation. So in general, yes, I would have had discussions in general terms, but I wouldn't have seen that it was appropriate for that I could really influence such change in prescribing patterns.
If we just look at BHCT 0000501, please. Now, this is a memorandum from the Eastern Health and Social Services Board, 25th of October 1984, supply of blood products. It says it's been agreed that with effect from the 1st of December 1984, all of the blood products as identified on the attached schedule must be obtained from the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service, and none should be purchased or obtained by a UMG directly. Local arrangements should be negotiated with Dr. McClelland, Director of Blood Transfusion Service. Now, unfortunately, we don't have the attached schedule, so we don't have the list of blood products to which this arrangement was intended to apply. As far as you can recall, in relation to the purchase of commercial factor concentrates, did that fall within this arrangement so that it was now to be obtained through you, or did it continue to be the position that Dr. Main obtained those directly herself?
Reading this letter, this memo, it's a very general update on the new arrangements from one manager to the managers of all other hospitals in Northern Ireland. It doesn't really get into the special arrangement in relation to the haemophilia centre. That's not really dealt with in this letter. It would be more relevant to arrangements in respect of other products like albumin and immunoglobulin, where this arrangement, this new arrangement, would apply as exactly as set out here. Obviously, there is the special arrangement with respect to the haemophilia centre, which is not really dealt with in this memo.
And if we look at RHSC 5066_024, now this is a rather later document. This is dated February 1989 from the board's Treasurer's Department, and it's Blood Transfusion Service financial position on baseline funding. If we go over the page, there's a broad description, including of the arrangements with the Protein Fractionation Centre. Sorry, can we see the whole page, Sally? So you'll see there, we don't need to zoom in on any particular paragraph, but we've got the heading blood products from the Protein Fractionation Centre, Edinburgh is paragraph 1. Paragraph 2, commercial blood products required in place of or as a supplement to PFCE supplies. And then it says, this is the bottom of the page, these commercially produced blood products which were acquired either in preference to PFCE products or as a top-up for limited PFCE supplies, were purchased centrally for the Northern Ireland region by the Blood Transfusion Service with effect from the 1st of January 1985. And these two are, and then the top of the next page, charged to other boards on an actual cost basis. And then, before I ask you about it, if we just read paragraph 3, supplies to the Haemophilia Centre, Royal Victoria Hospital. This says all clotting agents, factor 8, factor 9, etc., are managed exclusively in the Haemophilia Centre, Royal Victoria Hospital under Dr. Main, the Centre Director. All supplies of clotting agents, whether obtained from PFCE and routed through the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service or obtained directly from commercial sources, e.g. Profilate, Hyate, Viva Autoplex, must be delivered directly to the Haemophilia Centre. Mr. Carville, the Senior Chief MLSO in the Blood Bank, Royal Victoria Hospital, under the direction of Dr. Main, is responsible for the ordering and control of all clotting agent supplies, as the Haemophilia Centre is solely responsible for the provision and management of all clotting agents, all supplies required either for EHSSB patients or for patients admitted to hospitals outside the Eastern Board, issued in respect only of named patients under Mr. Carville's control. And then, if we skip over a paragraph, the paragraph in bold says, the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service bears the cost of all clotting agents issued from the Haemophilia Centre in respect of supplies provided for patients in hospitals outside the Eastern Board and for home use at non-EHSSB addresses. So that paragraph would appear to suggest that the ordering of the commercial concentrates continued to be the responsibility of the Haemophilia Centre rather than the Blood Transfusion Service. But if we just
That's right.
Is that's your understanding of the practical arrangement?
That's correct, yeah.
If we go to the bottom of the previous page, so where those last 4 lines say these commercially produced blood products, and we can see that they include albumin, immunoglobulin and clotting agencies, were purchased centrally for the Northern Ireland region by the Blood Transfusion Service with effect from the 1st of January 1985. Is that talking about it from a budgetary position then?
Yes, that's correct. It is purely from a budget. As far as clotting agents, certainly factor 8 and well, all clotting agents is concerned, it is really only the financial arrangements that are referred to here, the funding being centralised at the NIBTS, but not the actual procurement. It did have the effect that as the cost of clotting agents, factor 8, etc., had climbed quite rapidly during the 1980s, and the cost escalating, that it was showing up as a major overspend on the NIBTS budget, which I found myself having to explain to various people within the bureaucracy, Department of Health, etc., who maybe didn't understand fully how the system worked. But yes, that was the range. The finance people were keen to maintain this position. I mean, I had some reservations about having to account for something over which I had no control, but the finance people were keen to maintain this centralized arrangement, I think because they felt they were in a better position to understand exactly what was going on, rather than having to rely on getting information back from the hospital. as well as BTS. In other words, relying on different sources of information. At least they were, in terms of planning, financial planning, they were in a position to know what was happening.
Okay, we can take that down, thank you.
I don't know if that answers your question.
And do you recall any of the other bodies or agencies involved, whether it was the Eastern Board itself or the Northern Ireland Department of Health or the Chief Medical Officer, any of those bodies getting involved with this issue of whether too much was being used by way of commercial concentrate at the haemophilia centre?
Sorry, Mr. Richard, I seem to lose a bit of that. Would you mind repeating?
Of course. On the issue of whether too many commercial concentrates were being used by the haemophilia centre, do you recall whether the Eastern Board or the Northern Ireland Department of Health or the Chief Medical Officer for Northern Ireland became involved with that question or expressed any concern about it?
Yes, as I recall, it was a continuing concern, which was, you referred earlier to those coordinating meetings at the Eastern Board, annual meetings at which this matter was discussed. And, that was a big concern. Having said that, I think my understanding always was in relation to the cost of these products, whereas the department and the Eastern Board were very concerned about the cost, and they wanted to have as much advance warning as possible about the likely future cost. I was never aware that any real form of cash limit was placed, I think, in this area. In other words, it seemed to be accepted that this was an inevitable expenditure. I mean, I was aware that as far as I understood, haemophilia centres in England and Scotland, there probably was a budget for this to cover blood products. So there were cash limits applied, but I don't think that ever did apply in Northern Ireland.
And do you have any recollection of how Dr. Main responded when issues relating to the use of commercial concentrates were raised with her?
Yes, I remember some very detailed letters responding really to requests from the board and department, particularly the Eastern Board, regarding the causes of this major expenditure, and to the point of setting out in detail for individual patients, even not by name maybe, but the reasons why so much material was being required for certain situations. There would seem to be quite a high level of inhibitor patients, and which used a huge amount of material, not just, of course, factor VIII, but also other products which were not available, were not human-derived even, but were extremely costly.
Can I move then to ask you a little about plasmapheresis? So as I understand your evidence in your statement and from the documents you've referred to, in the 1970s, there was the occasional use of manual plasmapheresis, but the extent to which you could develop any broader programme of plasmapheresis was limited by the transfusion services facilities. Is that right?
Yes, I mean, I think the plasmapheresis in the 70s would only have applied to the collection of plasma for special reagents. In other words, either donors or antenatal patients who were identified as having a particularly valuable antibody and were asked to donate their blood or their plasma. The most efficient way was to donate the plasma. That it would really have been for the production of blood grouping, special blood grouping reagents, not standard ABO blood grouping reagents, but particular antibodies. Then when the arrangements with PFC started up, there was, as referred to in your correspondence there, the establishment of an anti-D program. And that was set up in 82, 83. That involved the immunization of the recruitment and immunization of donors to produce this antibody. And the method used at that time, this was relatively small there were relatively small numbers of people involved, quite a time-consuming process involved, and many visits, different visits of the donor before they were even in a position to start donating. So it was a time-consuming process for donor and staff. And the numbers going through actually donating plasma was quite small. So manual plasmapheresis was the method used. Then at that point, in any case, the machines available were not completely regarded as safe, I think, it would be fair to say, to use outside of a hospital setting. But that changed especially with the development of the hemonetics machines, which became available in the mid-80s and were designed to collect sort of routine plasma collections, and led to many centres, including our own, starting to collect just routine plasma. So this is no longer, in addition to these special plasmas, anti-D and other hyperimmune plasmas, we were now starting to use these new machines. There was a working party that set up a code of practice for the use of these, and this really meant that the way was now clear for centres like ourselves that were not in a hospital setting to very safely use this process to collect more plasma.
So is it correct to understand that from your evidence that one of the limiting factors which meant you couldn't use machine plasmapheresis more widely any earlier was the fact that you were not located as part of a hospital, but were this separate and discrete building in Durham Street?
Well, no, I think from the point of view of quantity, once we were up and running, the major limiting factor was actually the size of the facility. We would not have been in a position at Durham Street to utilize more than 3, I think it was a maximum of 3 machines. So that limited us in the amount of plasma that could be collected in that way.
So if we pick it up from your statement, Dr. McClelland, WITN 0892001, page 23. page 23. So we can see you set out in the first main paragraph of your answer on that page, you refer to the specific anti-D programme established with PFC. And then towards the bottom of the page, you say, with the early apheresis machines, it was a requirement that their use had to be restricted to a hospital setting where resuscitation facilities were available. This continued to be the case into the 80s. The NIBTS Centre HQ was not based in a hospital at that time. With the availability of a new generation of machines, this requirement no longer applied. And then if we go over the page, if we pick it up, the bottom half of the page, you say under subparagraph D, the plasmapheresis programme augmented supplies of plasma and later platelet concentrate. By the early 1990s, NIBTS was collecting over 3,000 plasma donations per annum. This was the maximum throughput that could have been achieved in the old NIBTS building and represented about 10% of total FFP being sent to PFC. So just pausing there, so it's the limitations of the building that essentially imposed a cap, did it, on the amount of that could be collected by way of plasmapheresis?
Sorry, I'm just yes, I was just reading your. Yes, it was. Yeah, that's correct.
And then we see, you continue, that when the service relocated to the new purpose-designed centre in 1995, donation facilities were enhanced, allowing more apheresis procedures. But you've explained that that's the point at which priority had shifted to platelet concentrate.
Yes.
So
yes, it has. Yes, indeed. The demand for platelets had increased very rapidly throughout the 80s and continuing into the 90s. And it was also desirable, if at all possible, to single donor platelets. We talked about limiting pool size. This also applied to platelet concentrates. If at all possible, it was a better product, a safer product, to provide single donor apheresis platelets as opposed to a pool of 4 to 6 units of platelets. But it has always been a mixture. I mean, at this point, we had come to rely on apheresis platelets to actually meet the demand. So that was encroaching, that was a factor that came into play when looking at any further enhancement of plasmapheresis. Not only the facility, not only the space, even in the new facility now, but also the donor pool, because you were really tapping into the same we're talking here about very enthusiastic donors who are prepared to give so much of their time to donate plasma or platelets. So we are looking at a similar pool of donors. So yes, in my opinion, platelet pheresis is something that had to be considered alongside the plasmapheresis program.
And then a second strategy I wanted to ask you about briefly in relation to working towards achieving self-sufficiency was the use of red cell concentrates. And we can pick that up, I think, from your statement. Can we go to page 27, please, Sally? So you were asked at question 32, what steps, if any, did the NIBTS take to persuade hospital clinicians to use less whole blood and more red cell concentrates. And you responded, education of clinical users of blood/red cells and persuasion towards the use of red cell concentrates instead of whole blood was a key part of the strategy towards achieving self-sufficiency. Without this, the programme referred to above could not have been as successful. The most effective route of influence was via staff in charge of hospital blood banks, haematologists and laboratory staff. Dr. Barucha and I took every opportunity to influence these staff, who in turn were in a position to influence the clinical users of blood in each specialty. Now, what was the response to your efforts and the efforts of Dr. Barucha to try and persuade the staff in charge of the hospital blood banks to use more in terms of red cell concentrates?
I think the response was very positive. In many ways, I would even go so far as to say it was more positive than I expected. One heard from experience of other parts of the country that there was resistance to the use of red cell concentrates in certain clinical situations. I think we found that actually in persuading clinicians that for certain clinical situations, there was no benefit in using whole blood as opposed to red cell concentrates. That seemed to be accepted quite well. And I think the figures show really that we were able to move quite rapidly to a much higher proportion of red cell concentrates than we started with in the early 80s. Obviously, a big benefit was which became available, I think, at 86, 87, the availability of optimal additive solutions, which we adopted quite quickly. I think we were one of the early centres to adopt this method. And I think it's been explained by other people to the inquiry how it works, but it basically enabled us to harvest more plasma. I think about 60, 70 mils of more plasma than one could without optimal additive solutions. So this meant that because the problem of viscosity, which certainly did apply, Dr. McClelland in Edinburgh, I think, referred to this, the problem of viscosity in certain clinical situations, which would have been a problem, no longer was a problem because with optimal additive solutions, the viscosity was equivalent to that of whole blood. Sorry.
And the optimal additive solutions, that is the addition of SAG-M or SAGM, as some other witnesses have referred to it.
That's correct.
And prior to that becoming used in the Northern Ireland service, in as you say, around 1986, 1987, were the clinical users still fairly resistant to the use or increasing use of red cell concentrates? Did the SAG-M availability represent a sea change in their attitude, or was it more gradual?
No, I think it was already, I think we had already got to something like 75 to 80% concentrated red cells even before we introduced SAG-M. So that's why I say the response was actually quite positive. I think by 86 we'd gone from something like 20% to 75 to 80% concentrated red cells in the space of about 3 years or 3 or 4 years. That may sound quite a lot, but there was, compared to many, I think the experience of many centres, that was pretty quick.
Thank you. Sir, I note the time and I'm going to move to a separate topic, so perhaps time for lunch.
Yes. Well, in which case we'll take a break now until 2 o'clock and come back then. 2 o'clock.
Thank you.